Hi everyone, and welcome to a new session with Code with Sally. The session runs every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern Time currently. If you have any questions anytime, you can reach out to me on Slack for Code with Sally or on LinkedIn, and I will do my best, whether to answer you one-on-one or like to create a new video or dedicate a Q&A session, and we go through your questions and answer them. For anyone who's joining us today for the first time, I would encourage you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. This is where I always upload the videos, whether like it's a live session or a complimentary video here and there. Currently, we are working on the intermediate series. We finished the beginners. For the intermediate series, if you open it, and the same applies for the beginners, the videos are sorted by default from oldest and newest. So always start from the top and move to the bottom, because we always start with the basics and keep adding to it. And with the intermediate series, currently we are talking about asynchronous apex, the type of asynchronous apex. So you'll start with future methods, understand what interface is. We finished Qubel apex, so if you missed it, watch it. And today it's a new question, a new topic related to asynchronous apex still. And again, if you have any questions anytime, ping me and I will do my best to answer you. And today during the session as well, if you have any questions, please go ahead and ask. I keep an eye on the chat as well in case you want to type your questions instead. And any questions very useful. I learned from your questions, and others as well learn from your questions, so keep them coming. Last time when we finished the Qubel, we had this question, we saw together how future worked and how Qubel is more flexible and have more strengths and override or overcome the limitations we had with the future method. We ended up the session last time with a question okay, we saw that we use Qubel, we can do changes, we can send an email, we can do anything we want in asynchronous. But sometimes we have some requirements that would require that you get a lot of records and update a lot of records in bulk, like thousands and millions of records. What's the best solution? Or in that case, what would you use to update those records, specifically when they are millions or too much records that we want to update at the same time, or sequentially, but in the same transaction. So that's the question we'll be answering today. So today, or the answer to this question, when we want to update, modify, do some operation on huge number of records, it's not like 100 record or 1,000 record. The best solution would be always to go with batch apex, because it has higher limits and because of its nature and how it's working. And that's what we will learn together today. So again, we cover future, we covered Qubel, and now the turn is on batch apex as the third type of asynchronous apex we'll be learning about. It's very important to know what is batch apex and why we would need to use it or when to use it. So as I mentioned, you'll find yourself using batch apex, or the solution would be to use batch apex when you have large amount of data. And the benefit of batch apex, that Salesforce will take this huge amount of data and will start splitting it into chunks, into smaller groups, and it will start performing our logic on those group, one group at a time. And each group will have its own limits as well. So sometimes you may have too much records to perform without hitting the limits. So the batch job will help you doing that. So it's used mainly to process large amount of data. It's one of the types of the asynchronous apex. And for anyone who didn't join us before, asynchronous apex means it's running in the background. It's not like when we execute the code, we run line by line, and apex will never jump from line 1 to line 3 until line 2 is completed. That's synchronous, like we have to do it in sequence, a line at a time. With the asynchronous, that means the code doesn't have to wait. Sometimes, like you start an asynchronous apex, you call a queuable, you schedule a batch job, or you put a queuable in the queued waiting room, waiting for the resources to be available to be picked by Salesforce. That means it runs in the background and it's not holding the code from continuing. Like you'll find yourself moving to the next line, even though the line number 2 where it's calling an asynchronous apex is not completed. So it's running on a different transaction in the background. That's like the meaning of batch, or like asynchronous in general, and like the batch is one of them. As I mentioned, like Salesforce, you'll find the benefit of that Salesforce will be breaking or splitting the amount of records you have. If like you have 1,000,000 records, it can split it into chunks. If you don't specify how many records you want in one chunk, Salesforce will divide it like by default into 200s of records together. So each 200 are together in one chunk. And again, Salesforce does that as a benefit for us for using batch and to avoid hitting the limits and the governor limits enforced by Salesforce. So it's huge advantage when you don't want to hit the limits and you have a lot of records with a lot of operation or updates that you need to do. It's perfect for a lot of use cases. In my experience, I've been working with Salesforce and coding in different companies and different projects since 2010. I cannot recall a single project where I didn't need to write an Apex batch job. So Apex batch is very common. It's used a lot. Sometimes it's data cleanup, like we can come and say, okay, I have old data or messy data or inconsistent values. I want to clean them up and start cleaning my data. So you have to go through a lot of records with minimum where clause or minimum where conditions to limit the number of records you're dealing with. Or you want to do mass update, and I will explain that shortly as well in another example. Or you want to do a reporting, like you have to go through millions of records to get totals, biggest number, smallest number. Like you may need to do some kind of reporting by going through a lot of records to find a pattern or find a result. So again, it's very useful because it can deal with a lot of records. As of now, when I was recording the video, the limit is to return 50 million records. It may get higher, lower, depending on Salesforce. So I would encourage you to check the governor limits, but currently it's 50 million records that you can get back in the batch, and you can never work with 50 million in one transaction. So that's where the batch job is useful, because Salesforce will divide it into chunks for you, and each chunk will run and execute in its own transaction and its own governor limits. So another story, like, and I saw this again in multiple projects in different scenarios. Sometimes you, like out of the blue, someone decide like we need to do a change in the data model and we need to add a required field on the opportunity. And in real life, sometimes you have to do it, and like they want to enforce it. It's not like some people will say, okay, we want to enforce it in the object field level, and to make it required, we'll make it in a validation rule that we can turn on and off. Or sometimes they will say, okay, we will make it on the page layout. It happened multiple times that the decision of the team lead or like the architect on the project or the client insisted that we have to do it on the field level. So it's not an option to do it with a validation, and it wasn't an option to do it on the page layout. And again, even if you do it with a validation, what if you go back and you try to edit one of the older records that has this new field as an empty field? The validation will be fired. So it gets complicated. So sometimes the solution is to go through backfilling the new required field in the older records. And to do that, again, you can imagine if an org has been up and running for a couple of years, you have a lot of records, to just do it with the developer console to get the records where this field is empty and just update it in one go, you will hit the governor limit. So in that case, we have to do it because, as I said, like older records won't have it. So saving can become an issue. And that sometimes like result in blocking some automation running, some user trying to edit older objects, older records. So the solution is to backfill it. And this is where like the batch job will come into like the decision to be used to backfill the required fields with, for example, a default value that you agree with from the business. So now we understand like the big picture when we need to use it, or what is a batch Apex. So we want to know how we can write it and how it works. We go through it like with an explanation, just with the slides now, and shortly we'll do a live demo or live coding example together. So first of all, like we'll have to implement an interface called database.batchable. If you miss the session for the interface, you'll find before even starting the queuable or the batch, we paused and we explained what implements mean and what is an interface. So I would encourage you strongly to watch it because it's like it based to what we are explaining now, and you don't need to memorize it. But let's say if you remember, like you have with the interface, it's a contract, and a contract means like you will specify certain methods that any class that implements this interface needs to have. So if I open like the documentation, the maximum you need to memorize that you need to implement the batchable interface, but you don't need to remember the methods or what parameters they should take, because you can open the batchable interface and you go to the methods. It has something called execute, something called finish, and something called start that has to overload one of them you will be using. So that tells you why it was important to understand what is an interface. But for Apex Batch class, we'll be implementing database.batchable interface. As we said, like an interface is a contract, so we have to comply with the contract. So we have to implement the three methods mentioned here in the interface: execute, finish, and start. Today, we'll understand together how it works and what's the purpose of each of them. So for the start, like from the name, that will be the first one that will be executed when you execute your batch job. And the purpose of this start method is to return the records that we want to process. Like you may want to get all the opportunities. So that will return all the opportunities in your org. Maybe you want to just get the opportunities created last week. So you would write a so-called in the start that will return only the opportunities that was created last week. Sometimes as well, like we use a batch job to clear the logs. So we said like when you work with Apex, it's good to have a try and catch and to log your errors. And in some cases, to log your errors, you would create a custom object and you keep the errors there so someone can monitor and see the details of the error. But if you keep doing that, the object or the records will become more and more. and it will consume a lot of your storage unnecessary because you would check the errors that happened yesterday, the day before, but you won't go back like 3 months ago to check what was the errors there. So you may want to run a batch to clear and delete the records that was created, for example, 3 months ago or prior to a certain date. So the start will be your go, where you will be writing your query that specify what to return. Is it based on a condition, on a date, everything? So that will return all the records that you can deal with, up to 50 million records. Then execute. This is the second method that Salesforce will execute for you. So we are talking about the order of execution here. So the execute will be the second one. And the execute, like the start will run only once because we are getting everything. Execute will run multiple times depending on your chunk size. So if you don't specify, like I want every 1,000 records to be a chunk, Salesforce by default, whatever records returning from the start will split them into chunks for you of 200s. So unless you instructed otherwise that you have a different size, less or more. So that means if you have 400 records, you will have the two chunks because it will be split into first 200, second 200. That means the execute will be executed 2 times.
So,
Yeah.
Sally, with the chunks, now are we coding for that, or we just update 1,000 records and Salesforce automatically handles the chunk?
Salesforce automatically will do the chunking for you. You don't do anything. What you can control, you can override the default. So the default is 200. You can tell Salesforce, I want my chunks to be 50, for example. I want my chunks to be 400, 600. So you can control the size of the chunk if you want to. If you don't specify, and we'll see together how you can specify it or not. But if you don't specify a size, Salesforce will be chunking them by default every 200. But how to chunk it or how to like split it or anything, it's done for you. You don't control that. It takes the records that return from the start and starts splitting them into 200s. And for each 200, which is one chunk, will run the execute. If you had your chunk size 1,000, so for each 1,000 is a chunk, and the execute will run for each 1,000 records together. Make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so the start was the first. Execute will run multiple times depending on how many chunks you have, unless you have only one. And the third one, or the last one that will be executed is finish method. And this will run after all the chunks and all the execute method finish. So after everything is done, the finish will be executed. And that sometimes is useful, for example, if you want to either queue something else to start, like execute another batch job or a queuable method, or sometimes if you want to log some details like how many records you updated, or you want to send an email to notify someone that the batch job ended and give some summary, how many records failed, how many records succeeded. So the finish will be your go in that case for any logic that you want to execute after all the execute methods are done and all the records got processed, whether deleting, updating, creating, like whatever the logic you have there. The finish will be executed last. Again, Salesforce is the one that is like handling the splitting the records into the chunk. You don't need to worry about it. You just need to create a class where you will implement a batch job, batchable as the interface. And because the interface enforces you to have 3 methods, so you'll have to create those 3 methods. And Salesforce will do the magic for you to call start first, then execute multiple times, then finish at the end, including the chunking and splitting your code into 200s or 1000 if you are specifying otherwise, like, and you are not using the 200, the default value. And we'll try now together, step by step, creating our first batch Apex. And we want to make sure everyone understand the logic, what we are doing, why we are doing. And then after we finish creating the batch, we'll see how we can execute it. And we'll try as well to explain how you can specify the chunk size, like whether you're relying on the 200 default or if you want to fill or specify a certain number. So let me open here this one. I will close. Let's go to backfill opportunities. So the logic here, I created a new field. You won't have it in your org. So I created, let me take this copy and I refresh query here. So that shows to me, for example, now that we have 531 opportunity. All of them, the business type is empty. And I'm simulating like a case that you may face in real life where out of like new requirement, new business, something came up that you have to keep an eye on what's the business type. So this is a new pick list I added. By default, it would be empty for all the records that created before starting to use this field. So what we want to simulate now, that will be writing a batch job that will go and update those records. I know now they are 531 records, and we could have done it like with developer console the same way as I emptied the business type. But let's imagine those are like 10,000 records, 50,000 records. You won't be able to do this with the developer console. Otherwise, you will hit like the governor limits and get issues. So I just have smaller amount of data because this is a developer org. I don't want to run out of space and memory, storage. So that's why I keep it to the minimum, and also because I don't want the batch to take so long while showing you how it works. So in real life, you will have an org. Most probably you will have more than 500 records and you want to update all of them. So you will be creating a batch job to do that. So let's go. The first step to do it is that we want to create, yes, Ken.
Oh, just a quick thing, and that maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but does it matter what type of field it is?
No, it's like you may be deleting records. You may be updating a field, standard field, or like custom field, pick list, string, number. It's whatever data you want to backfill or to clean. Like sometimes maybe you were not enforcing that US will be USA and Canada not to be CA. You wanted as a full word as a Canada, and that's messing up your reports, and you figure it out like you have CA and you have CN by mistake, and you have US and you have United States of America. So you have different values and you want to standardize them. So maybe you want.
Yeah, sorry, I just meant the data type. Like, is there anything when you're doing the actual Apex that you have to specify the data type, or it'll just fail, like if it doesn't align?
It can fail if it doesn't align. Let's say like if you have a pick list and the pick list is doesn't allow, it's not open values, like you have is a restricted pick list and you have to follow. It can fail the batch if you don't have like if you're not handling it right. So if again you're trying to put a value that is not supported, or let's say it's a text field and you are exceeding, it may fail. So that's why it's always good idea to have a try and catch. And also if you're updating, let's say thousands of records or like the 200 records in the one chunk, to use database dot update with all or none as false rather than using update. So you don't fail the whole batch because one record has a wrong value or invalid value to be used. Did I answer your
Okay.
question?
Yeah, and just to follow along, the business type field that you created, is that a pick list or a text field?
This one I created as a pick list.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Okay, so the first step will be creating an empty class. So I just went and did that before the session. I named it Backfilled Opportunities. Sometimes people prefer not to specify a prefix or a suffix. I prefer to have at the end with a batch, but because the file name now doesn't have it, so I keep it without, but it's good idea to have it with a batch towards the end or as a prefix at the beginning if you prefer, if that's the naming convention you want to use within the team. Sometimes some teams don't prefer to have a prefix or a suffix, so you have to make sure you are following the best practices within your team. But the first step will be creating an empty class, and that's what we have. Then I will try to add or implement the interface. So here to implement the interface, we learn together, we'll do implements, and the interface is database.batchable, and it takes as object like that. So let's try to save it. I don't expect it to get saved without issues because I'm not complying with the interface. You notice here, it will tell you, okay, you need to have start method, you need to have execute method, and you have to have the finish. So that's something very important to keep in mind, that it's very important to, you don't need to memorize in other way. Like the maximum you need to know that when we are working with batch, that's the interface I need to be implementing. And it's easy to Google that and remember the name of the interface if you don't memorize it. Like I don't memorize anything while working with Salesforce. It's hard to keep up with the syntax and memorize every interface we need. But if you know the interface and you implement it, that will tell you, okay, what are the methods, then you have start, execute, and finish. Let's start with the start method. The start method, if we go here, and I go to the documentation, you will find that it has two overloads or like two types we can work with. I'm not working with the system.iterable now, so let's keep this for now. We are working with something, it will return something called database.queryLocator, and it takes database context job ID. So let's do that. I will have this for me. And the start, we said, this is where we'll have the query or to return the records that we'll be working with. So to do that, I will do return and I do my query locator. So it returns a query locator, and the query locator will get me the records that I want to deal with. So between the brackets here, all we are doing is adding our so-called statement. So our so-called statement here, for example, I want to get all the opportunities where the business type is none. I want to update them. So if, for example, we updated, created records before running this batch and we started having like a business type value, I don't want to override it. So you will always have to think about your where clause if you have any. Most probably you will have, and you have to be careful. And what I do before like proceeding and start using this query, I would always recommend that you take your query in Salesforce Inspector in the developer console, run it, and run the query to make sure that it's doing or returning the records that you are expecting. So here I'm returning all the opportunities where business type is empty. So I just double check that and make sure my query is working as expected. I don't leave it until I try to run the batch. I try to save. Now you'll notice that your errors was reduced, that you are missing two methods only, the execute and the finish. So this one returns all records matching your so-called. Next, we said like Salesforce will chunk the records into 200, or if you specify a number of records or chunk size, it will use it. So the next one is execute. And again, if you want to see what parameters or what does it return, you can refer to the documentation. So you can go here and you'll find execute. Execute is a void. You'll check the signature. Execute has to be the same name. It takes the same batchable context job ID, and the list of records that return, or like the list of records here will be the chunk. Like Salesforce, you have thousands of records and divided them into 200 chunks. So this will have the list of the first 200, then the second 200, then the third 200. With every execute, it will have which records you are dealing with in this execute method. So here I have my scope. Again, you can name it whatever the value. I find people usually like use scope as like, this is the scope of the execute, and it's a list of opportunity. I know that I'm dealing and returning opportunities, so it's a list of opportunities. And here you do your logic. For example, here we want to backfill the value. So all what you want to do is to for loop on the opportunity and update the business type to legacy and do the update. And to answer the question, like, it's a best practice to have a try and a catch. Because we don't want unhandled exception, and we don't want the whole like batch to fail. So you will do the try and catch. You put here in the try, this one, to loop through the opportunities, update or backfill the business type. In the exception, it depends on what you are doing. Like if you have a log object, you can log in it. I don't prefer just to do like system.debug is not enough, because you have to have a debug log active and see it. We discussed before that you can use Nebula. It's a managed package for logging and keeping the errors logged, and it has its own batch jobs and objects. It does everything for you. And we said, like, at some point we'll try to demonstrate it in one of our sessions. So here, for now, I will put like log the error. And one of the line of the logic you have here is the update. This is something also is a good practice. When you are dealing with batch, I prefer not to do an update, because let's say you have your scope 200 and one of them failed to do the update. If you do the update scope and you update everything, if one failed, it will go for the exception and it will stop your batch job. And most probably because you're dealing with like millions of records and a lot of records, you don't want to fail usually the whole thing just for one issue. So usually what we do, we discussed before, like we have database dot update, and it can take what you want to update, and the other parameter for it is all or none. Like, do you want to fail if one fails? Like, the answer is no. So that means if one fails, let it fail, but keep the rest like to proceed and to commit the changes for the rest. And you can database.update will return results. You can loop through it. We saw it before in another example. I'll keep it like simple now with the update, just to continue our demo for the batch. But as a good practice, use database.update with all or none with false, and handle the records here, like the results with the error. And I can give you an example in the GitHub how to do that. But for now, I'll keep it with that. So now if I try to save, so again, just to summarize, we did the start to get all the records we're interested in dealing with. The execute, you work with it with the mindset that it will have only some records. It's not like the 1,000 record that return from here. It will be in chunks, regardless the size of the chunk. And you are doing the logic you want to do for those records. Maybe it's a delete, maybe it's an update, maybe something else. It depends on your logic. Now, if I try to save, it's saying like we are missing the finish method. So for the finish method, again, you can check the documentation to see like the parameters. I love to go and refer to the documentation because I want you to be more comfortable checking and looking into the documentation and understanding, because there is a lot of examples and a lot of good things in documentation, but I feel people sometimes are not very comfortable reading it. So the finish, you'll find it's a void method and it takes the batchable context as well. So that's what we'll have here. And sometimes you'll find yourself writing a finish method empty, and that will make the job like to be saved with no issues. It won't force you to have a logic in it. Sometimes you may have a logging feature, like again, you're logging something somewhere or sending an email or viewing another job. We'll see an example for that next time for chaining, but you can do whatever you want in the finish. The finish will be executed only after the execute method is done, and the execute method will be called more than once if you have more than one chunk. So the finish will be the last to be executed.
Sally.
Yeah.
So I understand the use of the scope variable. It's a list, correct?
Yeah.
So when you did the start to collect your records,
Yes.
it's just automatically put in the BC variable because of the database.batchable context.
It will be in the scope. Like what Salesforce will do is will take the records returned from here. It will split it into batches or chunks for you. And each chunk will be called its execute method. So let's say here you have 1,000 records and you have your chunk size into 200. So you will have chunk 1, the first 200 records, and then chunk 2, and the next 200. And it will keep going until it finish. And each time, Salesforce will have the scope to have the records of chunk 1. Second time it will execute, it will be the records of chunk 2.
So is scope a part of the requirement, or you can use any variable name?
Yeah, no, you can use. So let's do that. List of opportunities. We can name it the way we want.
Well, that's where I'm getting lost because so the start, you don't give it any variable name; it just automatically loads it. I guess is that what you're telling me?
Yes, so it will get 50 million, 10,000 the records depending on your query. Salesforce, what it will do is it will start dividing them into chunks, into a group of records based on the size of the chunk. If you specify a size, and we'll see how you can specify a size, you can control this to be 1,000. So you will have only one. And someone else can say it's 50 and you will have more. So in that case, we have like how many? You will have 5, 3, 4, 5. So Salesforce will divide them into 200s. Each 200 together is a chunk. And that means in that case, the execute will be executed 5 times. First time, the list of opportunities will have the first 200 records. Next time, the execute will be executed. You will have the second 200. The third time, and so on until you are done executing the execute method 5 times and you covered all the records, then it will go for the finish method and it will execute.
Okay, great, thank you.
And it should save correctly now because we have implemented everything. Like we implemented the contract of the interface, which enforced to have start, execute, and finish methods. So that's the demo. Like we wanted to see like the steps. We created an empty class. We saw how we add the interface, and saving without the interface caused an error. We did the start method, and we showed the execute. Like this is where you will have the logic and what you want to do. And it will be repeated. This method will be executed more than once if you have more than one chunk. And you will have the finish, and this is where you would do any logic you want to execute whenever it's done. That can be calling another batch, that can be calling another Qubel method, Qubel class, or Qubel apex. It can be sending an email. Like it depends on the logic and what you need in your requirements. So that's like how you can build the batch. And again, I want just to stress, I don't want you to memorize the parameters and the method names and their return types. If you know that you have the batchable, you can rely 100% on the documentation. And the second thing is, you saw like when we had an error, it was saying like you have to have finish, and the finish will expect batchable context. So the error message will tell you like what is the parameter that it's expecting, and it said it's void as well. So even from here, like the three method, we have like which one is void and which one return. Here it says like it's return iterable or data based batchable. Sorry, iterable as object, but like here we wanted the other overload that do the query locator. So you from the errors you can tell what are the parameters and what is expected for each of the method. Or you can refer, I prefer to go through the documentation because it's clear to me to see the signature and understand each parameter, what it does. So after you finish the three methods and you save, now your batch is ready. So I have here a slide that explain like what we did as well. So what happened on, behind the scenes when you do the batch or you execute the batch. We said the first will be the start, and that will give Salesforce the big list of the records. And in terms of like, it can be 50 million, it can be 50,000, whatever the big list of the records, or it can be 200, whatever. Salesforce, what it will do, it will take this big list and it split it into chunks. If you don't specify the size of the chunk, it will use the default value. It will split it into 200s. Then the execute will be run for each chunk one at a time. And that's why we have here, if we have thousands of records, we have 5 chunks and it will be executed 5 times. Each chunk has its own transaction. So when you run the execute, it's a transaction on its own. So what means it's transaction on its own? It means it has its own limits. So you start with the limits 0 for it. So it's perfect for big data or huge amount of records because you don't want to hit the governor limits. And as we mentioned, the last one that will be executed after finishing all the execute methods will be the finish. And that's like where you do anything you want after everything is done, or you keep it empty. There is no must to have a body for it. Like sometimes people leave it empty or just log a message here or like in the log object. Okay, so now we've finished how to create a batch. We want to know how to execute it because we want to see how we can run it and make it like monitor it and see how it's doing or how many batches is done. Because sometimes when you have lots of records and you have a smaller chunk size, it will take long to run, and you want to keep an eye how it's doing. So to do that, if you remember when we work with Qubble, we said we will use something called system.enqueueJob. Here, the syntax for Salesforce, you have to use database.executeBatch method to run your batch job. And database.execute method will take two parameters. First parameter is an instance of your class, and we saw how to do that as well when we work with Qubble. We passed an instance of the Qubble Apex class. Here we pass an instance of our batch class. The second parameter is the scope, and here the scope size. It's not the records, exact records, and it's more like the size. This parameter, the scope, is optional, and this is where, like, when you do just one parameter and you pass the instance of your class, you don't pass a second parameter. Salesforce will deal with it as the default value is 200, but if not, like, you can specify the chunk. If you are using the query locator that we use today in our like example, the limit or the maximum limit I'm aware of as of today is 2000 record. Like, you cannot make the batch or the scope or the chunk size 4000. It would be maximum of 2000. I saw in the documentation optimal scope size to be a factor of 2000. Like, they suggest to have like 100, 200, 400, like to be increments in that way. But I worked before in a project, and we were hitting some governor limits, and we had to change and tweak that and play with the number until it succeeded with no issues. So you may have different numbers. It's a recommendation, it's not a must, but the scope is optional. So let's try it together. We have our class or batch Apex Strategy. Before executing it, I want to show you where we will be monitoring how it's going or how it's working. So let me refresh here, and I will go from the setup and Apex jobs. I will see here from the Apex jobs, it can tell me like this. For example, when we were working with Qubble, it showed like records for the Qubble. For the Apex batch, like if we have a batch class running, it will have the job type as Apex batch, and we can see the progress, like what's the status if it's running, queued. You can see, for example, here I was testing, so I got an error because we had a validation in a trigger. I had to remove it temporarily, checking the date, so it was failing. Here it will tell you how many batches you have and how many batches it's processing and the number of failures. So for example, here, because I had an error, it failed everything. So we had one batch and it processed one, but one failed. Here I had 3 batches because I'm not specifying a chunk size bigger than the 200, so it was default. And we have 531 records, so that got divided first to 200, second 200, and then the third batch will have the remaining. So first 400 will be the first 2 batches, then 131 records would be in the third batch. Like, it doesn't have to always be exactly 200 in each chunk. Let's see it together. I will open execute anonymous, and let me this one to clear the value. And here I will do the database that execute batch, and I'll get the name of my Apex batch to create an instance from it. So to create an instance means to create an object. So we do new and the class name to have an instance. So I was saying, like, the execute database.execute batch will work the same as when we were doing system.enqueueJob. It will give you a job ID, and that's what we can see here. Like, the job IDs here because again, you can keep an eye on the status and how it's working from the Async Apex job that we saw together when we were working with Cubo, or you can keep an eye on it from the UI here. So let's try and execute it. I will do an execute. I will refresh here. We'll see that we have 12:56 my time. We had a job. It's completed. It said 3 batches, 3 processed successfully, no failures. It tells you that this was the backfill old opportunities and the job ID. Let's see in the developer console. You'll find here this one. It's done fixing opportunities, the log that we have, and you will find that we have like chunk handler more than once because the execute method like executed 3 times. So that's how like the logs as well will have not just one log file, it will have more than one because each chunk will have its own execution on its own. And you could see here this one. Let me show you as well. Let's clear the value again. And I will try to change the chunk size so you can see it. Like here, when we executed, we didn't put a chunk size or a scope for it. So it just used the 200 to split it. And now I will execute it again. And let's say I put 1,000 instead. I want it all in one chunk. Definitely, like you don't know how many unless you run your query and you know your data. You don't go randomly higher, like you don't go and change the size to be like 1,000 or 2,000 out of the blue. Like you have to think carefully because you don't want to hit the limits or the governor limits. Sometimes even in some projects, because the batch job was heavy and it runs triggers and execute other logic in the background for me with the change I'm doing in the batch, I had to go lower to 50, I believe, my batch size. So sometimes you have to go down, like not usually to go up. Sometimes you have to go down. The bigger the chunk size, the quicker your job will be done if it doesn't hit a limit, because it will split it into less number of execute methods to run. The smaller the sizes, the longer your batch will be executed. So let's execute this one now. And I go here. I will see that now this one got executed this time in one batch. Even I have the 531 records, but because I increased my batch size to be the chunk size, I increased it to be 1,000. So the 531 records went in one go. So that's just to give you an example how you can like control the chunk size is by passing a second parameter, but it's optional. You can run it with no specification.
So you a number of times have gone into the developer console and run your scripts. Is there any particular reason why you do that as opposed to like setting up scripts in VS Code and then executing them from there?
Usually the 2 ways I run my batch usually is one is through the developer console. If it's a one time, sometimes you have like the backfill, most probably you run it only once. You don't need it something to run every week or every month. It's only once if you want to update data, old data, or to clean data, unless you know that sometimes you will get messy data in between through data load or something, and you want to run it once per month or so. So usually either I run it from the developer console myself, or I do a scheduled job and schedule it to run on specific schedule, like once per week, once per month. And we learn that together as well when we go to the schedule Apex. we'll try to schedule an Apex batch class and see how that will work for us. But if you want like to have a method in a class that will do the batch and you want to run the method, you can. It just, for me, mainly those are the two ways I use it, because either it's scheduled and I want to run it in a specific schedule, or it's a one-time thing, so no need to create a method for it or a specific logic to execute it. Unless, for example, one other use case, maybe you will have a button in a specific screen for an admin that they can initiate executing the batch, and you don't want them to go to developer console. So you may have it in a controller or a method in a class for LWC component. And when they hit the button, it will run the batch for them and give them the ID for the job or link to the setup to keep an eye on the batch. Okay, so we saw together as well how to track the progress in Apex and in Apex job in the setup. So that's another way to keep an eye on it. You can use the query you have here. For example, if I take this in the developer in Salesforce inspector and give it this job ID, I can see where the status, it will tell me it was number of the batches was 1 and it's completed, no errors. So you can use the SOCL statement and keep an eye on it, or you can use the UI. It's easier to check it from here. You can do either or, and that's to keep an eye again, because sometimes the batch job is too many records in small scope or small number of records in each chunk, and it will take long to be executed, and you want to keep an eye how it's going. The next topic, we want to see how we can test it, but it's 1:03 and I know everyone wants to go back to work. So we'll stop today at this step. Next time we'll see how we can, we have a lot to cover, to be honest, with the batch class. I'm not sure if we'll finish next time. We'll see. There is no rush. We want to understand and answer your questions. So next time we'll start with the testing. We want to know about something called stateful, or like the state of preserving the state across multiple execution, and we'll see how we can do that. And we still have like how to do training, how to pull external API from it. We saw that with the queuable, we saw that with the future method. So we want to see with the Apex, with the batch Apex, and also we want to see together a quick comparison between future, queuable, and Apex batch classes to give you like a cheat sheet kind of, or a quick summary. And so we'll see how it goes next time. Maybe next time will be the second and last, or if needed, we'll go to a third session for the batch Apex. So feel free to ask your questions. Send me any questions you have regarding to batch Apex, and I will do my best to cover it, whether in next session or the session after, to make sure everyone understands it very well. Again, it's used, in my experience, I didn't work in any project that didn't need an Apex batch class. So it's very important to understand it really, really well. Because it's used a lot. So any questions, send me and I will do my best to answer it. It was great to have you today. Please share the session with everyone else so they can watch it before the next time. And I hope it was useful and we added something new for you and to your knowledge. And I will see you next Thursday at 12 p.m.